You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast.
When did the whole vaccine thing start to kick in?
So that was almost all the way into, I guess, the following year. I want to say it was like February. I think they started talking about it. I can't remember the exact time and date that it was like starting to get kicked around. But I had already made a decision at that point. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really fit like categorically the way that we do things. And I've told people before, I'm not necessarily an anti-vaxxer. I'll tell you that after this, I've kind of started to push more in that direction, the more that I've had to force myself to learn.
You're not the only one. Yeah.
Yeah. I've kind of become one, I guess, honestly, at this point. But I mean, I had about 100 anthrax shots. I feel like you just never finish the series, which is funny because that was such a similar case years prior. All my flu shots every year, I did everything I could. I was on a recall unit. So we had a very special set of shots we had to get to be able to deploy to like North Korea or something like that if that came up. So like I said, there was always things in the Army that are ready to deploy to different places.
Oh,
and
geez.
like they keep people geared up for that. And that includes like Japanese encephalitis and yellow fever, like vaccinations that I didn't even know at the time if they were approved. But I knew my unit wasn't going there without me. So if that was what we might be called on to do, I stayed ready.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a talk that had happened at one point that I don't know how much I can actually go into, but just like legally. But then
sorry to interrupt you, but you said that you noticed that things were not the same as they used to do it. What were the differences that you started to pick up on that made it seem like it was a different animal?
So it was the reaction from people. So like it was never like if you were falling behind on your flu shot or something, they'd always be like, "Hey Rob, you gotta go get your flu shot." And I'd always be like, okay, I'll get around to it. And they're like, okay, we'll just let us know when you do. Like it was never any stress. But it just like it seemed like from the get-go, they were like, as soon as this shot's here, like we are doing a rodeo, like everyone in the entire state of Georgia is like going to be there. You don't have a choice. It was just like such a heavy-handed implementation for some reason. They're like, you will get it, you will be here at this time. There are no exemptions. And I'm like, why did you say it that way? Like it's so like, just like it came across so heavy-handed that I was like, I don't know. It seems like there might be something amiss with this, right? So I start digging into it a little bit. I find 40-562, section 2.6, and it talks about like if you've had.
What is that? Explain to the listeners what that is.
So it's basically for everything in the Army that there's rules about. There's either an FM, like a field manual, or a TM, a training manual, or there's some like Department of Defense booklet that outlines all of the current rules and regulations and policies. So 40-562 is actually across all of the services like Air Force, Army, Marine, Coast Guard, right? It uses a different name, but it's chemoprophylaxis is I think the word that's on it. But basically it's like how the military fights disease or handles those sorts of things. And exemptions, meaning that you don't have to participate in a particular part of that program, is covered in section 2.6. So I was like, well, they said no exemptions, but here's this thing that says if I've had it and I have previous positive or serologic blood tests, then I can file for an exemption. And what I didn't like is the rush that everybody had on it. And as I dug, I was like, well, you need like 3 years of human testing for this to be FDA approved. And I'd said that enough times that people were like, dude, it wouldn't be in front of us if it wasn't FDA approved. And I was like, no, you'd think that, but I'm telling you, this seems weird. And not a lot of people wanted to listen to me. And then Lloyd Austin came out with that letter shortly after that he said, I'm going to implement it, whether it gets approved or not. Basically, I can't remember the exact verbiage, but I still have the letter. Like when you ask for sources, that thing still exists. And I still have a copy somewhere in this box.
And real quick, Lloyd Austin's the Secretary of Defense. So this is essentially coming from top brass. You need to go take this, but it's not adding up to you. What was the pressure like that you were feeling when you were basically saying, this doesn't feel right to me?
So until the mandate actually started, most people were like, well, there'll be consequences. And that's all that anybody really said because they didn't really know. So the pressure wasn't too bad. And I basically got to kind of blow it off for a while. And just continued working. And like, we were still like being a COVID era drill sergeant was tough. Keeping 220 kids healthy, safe, separate, or whatever, like trying to do all that stuff. Even though we know now that most of that stuff wasn't working, these guys were wearing masks on the qual range. And it's like, this is stupid. I mean, it's 25 feet in between each one of them and they're alone on a platform. I'm like, let the kid breathe, so he can shoot accurately. They were like, their standards were dropping because we couldn't take them for runs on the street. So there was no long runs in basic. And when you think of boot camp, you picture people like running information and doing that. All of that got deleted for a while. We just stopped doing it. So they're already getting lower training and stuff like that. It was just a lot of stress on drills trying to make it work and make it worth, the students' time. But yeah, once the letter came out and he's like, it hit the market start date or whatever of approval, which was like August 27th, then it got like tremendous very quickly. Because the initial threats were, like dishonorable discharges, which is like not even a reasonable response to that. Like to think that, I would lose like this Wattenberg amendment, like I'm never allowed to own firearms. It's going to be hard to get a job ever again, like all over this shot, especially when there are exemptions. Like I said, it was such a heavy handed response that it kept pushing me further and further away from it, even though there's huge consequences at the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So just real quick, the threat of a dishonorable discharge was hanging over you and others who were hesitant to get the jab. And so you're not allowed to have guns, I guess? You can't own firearms after
if you get a dishonorable, yeah, that's one of the things. That's one of your rights you lose. You're going to lose all your VA benefits. So like me, who has now, I'll be honest, a pretty high VA rating. I've got TBIs. I broke my back on a parachute accident, multiple knee surgeries. I've got a lot that's happened to me. I'd lose all the support for that, and then just be out there still basically dealing with my injuries in the world forever. And then like obviously every job that you go to apply for, they ask for a DD 214. You're stuck explaining to them like, well, this is what happened and whatever, and it disqualifies you from a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like having a bankruptcy on your record trying to get a loan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty devastating threat. I would imagine if you're a career military person. So paint us a picture at that point in time. You're hesitating a little bit. You're getting this top-down pressure. Who's mandating it to you? What's the chain of command there?
I think most of the pressure was felt from about the brigade level down. Just to shape that up, I guess basically all of the basic trainings for the most part on Fort Benning fall under a couple of brigades, and ours was 198. So that's like all your infantry guys and stuff like that. And then I couldn't even tell you how many, maybe 10 basic training battalions. Each of those have 5 companies. Each company is like 220 students. So without doing all the tons of math to make that work in our heads today, brigade had most of the pressure because that's where most of the legal was being handled at the brigade level. There's not really a battalion level legal element. There's not like a battalion JAG. So I think that's why a lot of it came from the brigade, but it was just orders that were coming down. And then they were just like, our company commanders, who's like, there's only 7 to 10 drill sergeants, a first sergeant and a company commander who's a captain. And those two are the ones that basically give you all of your information from those upper levels. So that's kind of where that conversation started with me, was they're saying like, hey, everyone's going to sign this counseling statement. And a counseling statement, really, people use it as a punishment because they can like hold it over your head that there's this record, because multiple counseling statements is just a record of a conversation. But if we have a conversation enough times, they aggregate into a packet that is evidence for a discharge or a punishment. Right. So this is the first thing that comes out is this counseling statement. Honestly, I was going to say, I just found it when I was packing up the other day and I framed it, but I think I put it in because what happened with this counseling statement is, we penned this thing to death. Like I was reading it and it said, you'll receive the FDA approved shot. I'm like, oh, easy. Yeah, you don't have it. So yeah, sure. I honestly agreed on the first one.
It wasn't FDA approved.
Correct.
Right.
It wasn't.
So Lloyd Austin, in the letter that he sent out, I remember you saying that the wording was very specific. Do you recall what that wording was?
I can do my best. Basically, it was that you, like all service members, will receive, and it said in compliance with BLA labeling and guidance and FDA approval. So basically, like as long as it's labeled correctly and is FDA approved, you will get that one. So that was him saying a legal statement. He is allowed to do that. However, that thing didn't exist yet. So what happened was the shadow policy and enforcement underneath it, where people took their own interpretation of that and then crammed it down people's throats. Now, when I say people, was there back channels that the Pentagon was like, I don't care which one they get, make them get it? Pretty much guaranteed,
So at the time, it was not FDA approved, right? And so
correct,
it was saying you need to get it so long as it's FDA approved, but it never was really officially FDA approved. So there was that gray area that you were saying, hey, where's the approval, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So it was saying you need to get it so long as it's FDA approved, but it never was really officially FDA approved. So there was that gray area that you were saying, hey, where's the approval, right? So there was that gray area that you were saying, hey, where's the approval, right?
Yeah, and the way that I kind of liken it to is like what got approved was basically like, you and your wife are about to have a kid, and then a few months ahead you find out the baby's sex, and then you're like, all right, well, let's go with this name or whatever. You kind of kick it back and forth, and you guys decide like, okay, it's going to be Christina, it's going to be Jason or whatever. So you fully decide this is the name that we're going to approve it with, and that's really all that happened. Is they approved the planned label and name of this thing, and that was part of the BLA process. So there was an approved label, but basically the contents of what it was going to go inside still had a testing requirement.
Sorry,
So
which label was approved?
Comirnaty is what it was referred to as. It was kind of like, people pronounce it differently because I don't actually know which way it's supposed to be, but it's supposed to be like a mixture of the words community and immunity, and it was some play on words with that. But Comirnaty was going to be the Pfizer vaccine that was approved. So when people heard, oh, the Pfizer vaccine's approved, they kind of just like filled in the gaps with that, because anything that's still labeled EUA, whether it's the same formulation or not, is irrelevant. It's labeled EUA. That means it's an emergency use authorization, and you still have a informed consent element. And it's funny because like a lot of the informed consent stuff and like you can't test on people against their will came from the Nuremberg Code.
Right. Yeah, this is pretty shady stuff. Looking back now, for sure, but I can imagine at the time that at the very least, someone like yourself is asking questions. Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.